than me and my tone. You can't step to my throne.
Are we recording right now?
Oh yeah, we're always recording.
Okay, well then I'm not gonna say what I was gonna
ABR,
say.
always be recording.
Why?
Just legal purposes.
Podcast jargon.
No. All right, what's your topic? What did you want to discuss tonight?
I didn't want to discuss. This is your brainchild, so I just starting a conversation. So this is a conversation we've had in the past, and I don't think we actually got anywhere. I think we were trying to have it before we started pickleball one night, and so you brought it up to John, and they mostly foo-fooed it.
Morality?
Well, kind of. So I was reading a book the other day, and this came across, and this kind of reminded me of it, but so apparently this comes from Joseph Epstein. I hope there's no relation. Of the 7 deadly sins, only envy is no fun at all. And you and I have talked about this before, but so controversially trying to remove, religion, the 10 Commandments you might have been taught at one point in time, the things that you were told that you should do or that were right by somebody else. If you sort of create like the scientific approach to life, right? For the most part, you're going to dive into things that are interesting, dive into things that taste good, look good, feel good. And so you and I had this conversation where, this points out that the 7 deadly sins kind of reinforce themselves in a way. So, I think you and I talked about it with addictive drugs that produce a high. Like that's pretty appealing if you didn't have to go through some sort of an illegal circuit in order to be able to procure those drugs.
All right, here are the 7 deadly, because I couldn't remember all of them.
Oh, okay, go for it.
Lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride.
They all sound a lot better in Italian, but yes, that's them. So, and what he's getting at, right, is that other than envy, which just is a lose-lose, like all of the other ones in some form or another have, let's call it a fun side, right? So cue up all the religious people that are going to be happy I'm saying this, but
take me through that though, like wrath. What's the fun side of wrath?
Well, I think there are people that maybe bulldoze their way to the top through wrath, right? Like through
get their way if they throw a
sure.
fit.
Yeah.
Like the Karens of the world.
Which one?
I want to speak to your manager.
Oh, yes. But also out of anger, right? Out of bullying others. And I think that there's a piece of wrath that in the moment, in that very moment of unhinged, teapot whistling, that person feels good. Like that, there's this power trip that comes with that unhinged dive into fully indulging in what they're feeling, and they feel good about it.
So when you're on a golf course and things are going south,
100%, right?
You dump a brand new TP5 into a
throw your
lake.
golf clubs in the water for that split second. That feels somehow, I don't know,
throwing the
vindicating
clubs feels
right
good,
word.
or snapping them in half, or
exactly.
doing something.
Why do even on the pro tour they snap clubs after they make a bad shot? Like they break it over their knee, and that doesn't do them any good 5 seconds from now. But in that moment, I do. Like they even, right when you were growing up and in high school, at least everybody would always quote all of the studies that talk about how cussing or saying a cuss word in that moment actually produced the chemicals that it needed to in order to actually, let's say, improve performance or, like the grunting in tennis, right? It actually produces whatever it is, extra oomph, extra adrenaline. And so I think similarly that's where the wrath one comes from.
Yeah, I like lust, I get gluttony, I get greed.
Think Scrooge McDuck. swimming in piles of gold. That one's not hard.
Right, but is he happy with the success of that, like the gluttony of this, or is he happy with wanting more than somebody?
Well, that's envy, wanting more than somebody.
Okay. Pride, I get.
I mean,
Sloth
once
is
again, all
interesting.
of these have a bad side too. Like, certainly that's why they're the 7 deadly sins. That I'm not justifying. What I'm saying is to be absurdly rich, which in theory you would get through greed, if you continued to work hard and succeed, like then that would have.
This is another conversation, but I think that's dangerous to say like exceedingly rich is coming from greed.
Right. Well, yeah, you can be greedy and super poor.
Can you be super rich and not greedy?
Oh, well, yes, I think so. Yeah, you can be very wealthy and not be hindered or affected by greed.
Yeah.
But I also
so
think
we went
that,
off track a little bit. So what
well,
was your
no, that's
original
okay.
question?
I think originally, as you get more wealthy, though, at least everybody says to me, right? Like, oh, God, I was even having a conversation similar to this the other day where, once upon a time, somebody was like, well, if my salary is just 6 figures, like that's it, I'll have made it. Like, I'll be great. And then they reach that possibly at a medium point in their career. And then they're like, yeah, that changed. Right. And then all of a sudden it's,
7 figures.
7 figures. Sure. Or as soon as you make your first million, then you want 5 million. And then even though you did that, now you need 3 homes instead of 2 homes. And I know that compounds on itself. And so that's another one where oftentimes with that accumulation of things and wealth, because I think the desire to accumulate more, or the desire to get those more things, always wanting more, never being satisfied where you are, I think that's an element of greed.
There's that an element of evolution. I mean, just the fact that, way back when you're a hunter-gatherer of some sort, and when things can rot or whatever, you have to figure out a way to sustain, especially if you're in a colder climate, right? Or even your meal for the next day. Is that something where it's just kind of in our nature from a safety perspective, and then once we're safe, we're now wanting to get more just in case something happens? Because you're in the insurance world, I'm in the insurance world. Insurance is always the risk of what if, and we can all self-insure.
Well, funny you bring that up, because I think it's both, because I think that the reason insurance is so successful is because that planning, that organization, that thoughts toward the future, the thoughts toward the unknown are all important, and they're helpful in our, let's call it, advanced society. But I also think it's successful because people play on the fear of those unknowns, even when you could self-insure, right? So,
yeah. So I guess your point is, from a morality or religion standpoint, why is morality or religious stuff trying to curb these desires that seem to be a self-enforcing behavior?
No, so my original question about all of this is, I think drugs that produce highs, I think that, lust is one, I think that's pretty obvious for the highs that it produces. The things that, for most, I think they would gravitate towards if they were just kind of in that experiment. I know nothing about life. I have no predetermined guidelines that somebody has, placed upon me or my mentality. So I'm going to go out there and I'm going to sort of pursue the things that reinforce themselves. And so this isn't a conversation about how the continued pursuit of alcohol or the continued pursuit of drugs or the continued pursuit of, making a grinder and a Tinder profile and all of the above, like in the lust category, would produce a high. But like, I just am really interested in, your take on, so inherently in those things, then what makes them bad? Like, because if you had the scientific approach, it would seem that those things, if somebody could curb and not become addicted, if you will, and maybe that's where the crux of the matter lies, but that those things in and of themselves are more benign than law or religion would tell you that they are.
I think like animals, right? Like, do animals experience these things? And with lust, I don't know that they're feeling lustful. It's just that animal nature to reproduce. And so for the most part, there are multiple partners for most animals. Again, there are the exceptions. Gluttony. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience in the animal world, but I do have with dogs. And some dogs will be able to just eat and then they'll stop when they're hungry. Others get fat and they don't move, right? But it's interesting because it seems like lust, at least for most of the dominant world religions, is a play in there, right? Like it's kind of generally accepted, like don't cheat on your spouse and don't go sleep around from a religious perspective. And whether you're quote unquote active or not, it seems like even, I mean, Christianity obviously, and then even Islam, right? Like I don't think that they're really all over sleeping around.
Right.
And then, yeah, it's interesting with that. And I don't know if it's just people who are observing. Again, you can take the God aspect of it, but then also just basic human stuff. I don't know if they're observing in a society. It seems like when you're more monogamous, then that relationship between you and that individual, but also societally is stronger, right? Because if we expand outside of my family now to your family as well, and we're depending on each other for survival, and I can't trust you around my wife or kids, then that will theoretically lead to us being less productive and less able to survive than if we could all trust each other.
Well, yeah, no, I think those are good points. You know, I talked to you about the documentary I watched, which kind of dives into the origins of monogamy and how it was, you know, French kings and aristocrats who had kind of like in the Egyptian time, like not only concubines, but many mistresses. And like, so even if they had a wife, because it was the one that could produce heirs, or even if it was just that they had a lot of land and a lot of money and a lot of estate, they wanted to make sure that where their money was going was in fact to raise kids that were theirs or to raise their own heirs. And so then they kind of wanted to force everybody else into believing this, you know, monogamy idea, because that way it sort of put this second layer of protection against anybody coming and giving him a kid that he would then have to pay out a lot of money for and give some of his estate to that wasn't actually his. And
even that's changed, though, even if you want to go to the French, but take biblically, because I'm more familiar with Christian history, but biblically, there are times where many wives are thumbs up and other times where it's like, nope, can't do that. So it's weird how with all of these and all of the, call them 10 commandments or whatever else, there are instances in the scriptures, at least Bible-wise, where prophets, right, inspired men in this case, are breaking all of those and then kind of justifying it, which,
right,
I don't know, kind of makes me think.
It's just one of those ones where when trying to determine what's right or what you should be doing, this one's kind of interesting because if, like I said, if cocaine wasn't illegal and I didn't think that it was going to send you on a bender to going nuts and to losing brain cells or whatever it was, I think that at some point I'd come across it and try it. And so then at that point, I mean, the reasons that I haven't, right, abusive substances, it's like, okay, well, I guess somebody told me once that they're addictive, so I shouldn't do that. Or, you know, and then with the lust conversation, people get into STDs and people get into, you know, hearts are involved and humans are involved. And I totally agree with all of those things. But as far as what you would, you know, pursue that kind of reinforces itself of its own accord because it produces highs. Like that's literally the definition of Pavlov's, you know, reinforcement. It's just interesting that those ones are then you're slapped on the wrist. Like those are not you're supposed to do. And yet they have these inherent positive effects. So, and not really immediately, and at least in some of these, not really immediately have negative consequences. I mean, I know some of them immediately, some of them eventually. Alcoholism's an easy one where, you know, some people get deep into the bottle and can't get out, and it leads to depression and a whole series of things and family problems and so forth. And I know drugs have the same thing, and frankly, lust does too. Like, I'm reading this book that kind of dives into JFK, and I didn't know that. Like, I knew of like his apparently extramarital affairs with Marilyn Monroe, right? At least I thought so, because of the whole Happy Birthday song and how many times that's been parodied. But like, it was for real. And he had a problem that he was exposed to essentially by his father, because his father would bring home mistresses and call girls, I believe. And so that's kind of the attitude that he was given. And then he even shared at one point with one of his confidants when he was in the White House that, you know, if he went, I believe it was 2 days without climaxing, that he would like start to get headaches. And so then it just became this like rigorous routine. And so it was like Tiger Woods times 100 as far as, you know, and this was as the president of the United States, and good gracious, with social media, you wouldn't be able to do that. And not that you would want to, like, I'm not condoning any of this, but in that thing, right, obviously, like, it's literally reinforcing itself. And is that where the evil lies? Like, is that where it's bad? And maybe I'm a terrible person for even asking these questions. Maybe it's way more on the surface than I think it is, but I just know we've mentioned that one, and I don't know that you ever really gave me a full answer on why.
That's what I do, man.
These things that have these inherent reinforcement mechanisms are, you know, totally cast shadows on and said, and like to throw them into a corner. Don't talk about them. Don't do them. Stay away from them. They're bad.
My sister and her family were going on a trip to this family reunion thing, and some of the teenagers didn't want to go. And so they were coming up with these like radical excuses as to like, oh, we got to cancel the trip. I mean, it's like the night before, tickets are bought, everyone's packed up, and they're trying to get out of it some way, saying like, oh, I need to exercise every day. Like, well, why can't you do that? No, there where we're going. No, I can't do it there. So let's cancel the trip. And so it was interesting because it was like, and I was the same way as a teenager. Like, you can't see past your own nose. Like, everything is just right here, and everything is immediate. What about me right now? And I think that these are all fall into that. And again, whether it's a philosopher or a prophet or whatever you want to say by the people that are coming up with these things, I think that they're trying to extend that vision past the end of your nose of like, look, if you're slothful and you're laying around all day, your body's going to become worse off long-term, right? Lustful, again, long-term, all of these things, like the long-term consequences. I think that's just all of these are doing. And then they got turned into like, look, you're a bad person if you do these. Short-term, always, forever, you're going to hell.
Right.
Even though I think that they're brought up because it's in our human nature to pursue these things. And so spirituality-wise, it's always like raising yourself to a different plane of control, or whatever you want to call it, of spirit over body, because these are all kind of body urges. And again, the motivation behind that just kind of comes around however you believe they came to us.
Well, and most of them are discipline of self in some way, right? Even if it's an emotional self like wrath or pride, or frankly, I mean, sloth is physical, lust, gluttony, greed. I mean, but greed, wanting what others have, or wanting more of the thing that you have, or not being happy with what you currently have. I mean, those I think have to do with soul, and have to do with, we struggle to be content with that which we already have, like the things which we're already holding in our hands. So,
which is interesting though, because I mean, we've seen situations where the difference between content and complacent, like some are complacent of like, I don't want to do one more thing than what I'm already doing. And I feel like that's not necessarily a good thing. You're never growing, you're never reaching, you're never expanding. So does that become a greed thing or an envy thing of like, I want to get better at something? But then the content thing is the 6-figure salary as an example. Are you content with that? Because there are people that are content with half of that, and there are people who are not content with 10 times that. So it's kind of, what situation are you in? And can you always find that you're content but not complacent?
Yeah, it's interesting because Greg McKeown, I don't know if you've read his book Essentialism, and he's got a new one out, but he sends out a weekly email where he talks about it. And that's what he sent out this week. Like, he talks about how that constant pursuit of more and always being better there's value in it somewhere, but ultimately you have to figure out how to be happy and satisfied with where you are now. And so even if you do have a bucket list, he kind of points out the difference or this list of goals that you need to achieve. Like, sure, write it down, and look at it. But like, you can't become so attached to that you almost feel like your worth is based upon achieving those things. And
so what is your worth based on?
Yeah, no, it's good. I struggle with it because I know, in the pursuit of golf, like I wanted to shoot 67 for a really long time. It was on my list of goals. I was working pretty hard at it for 3 years. And then one day I shot 32 on the front. It happened. And I remember being stoked, but like 15 minutes after having shot 67 and had the round of my life, then you're just like, well, I'm not going to stop playing golf. Like I didn't shoot 18 on 18 holes.
Well, you can probably go back on that round and be like, oh, this shot, I could have shot a 66. And then there was this other shot, I could have shot a 65.
Oh yeah, 100%. But then you go out for the next week and you can't break 80. So it's just an interesting. I struggle with it.
But does your worth come from golf?
I think it felt like it because if I, it's interesting because I've kind of had this over the last year with COVID. I've tried to talk about Zen golf and trying to be happy when I'm out there and not get so frustrated. I kind of got word that I was playing with this group of guys where I don't know if anybody's ever done this, but there have been times that I've hit 18 greens in regulation and shot like 84. And sometimes I'm relatively close to the pin. And so to miss those opportunities, to not be able to capitalize, is just, it's probably the most frustrating version of a round of golf that I personally have had. Because you have all these opportunities to score and then you can shoot 84 a lot of different ways. You can only shoot 65 a handful of different ways. And I remember missing like a 10-foot birdie putt once. And I mean, I'll be blunt. I pretty much threw a tizzy fit, right? Like I think I jumped up and down and I just was like yelling at myself and these grown men are around and once again, probably very much in front of my nose. But I remember looking back on that and thinking,
was this like yesterday?
Could have been. It might as well have been. No, but it was a couple of years ago, which is still not great. But, and they were, I think they didn't say anything and nor would they necessarily, but I actually think they probably didn't want to play with me as much after that, which I totally respect. And they didn't say anything. It just kind of happened that way. And COVID allowed an excuse for them to not necessarily call me, which I wasn't heard about. Because when I go play, I'm kind of playing for me anyway, as was clear that I completely bubbled them out of my life in those 10 seconds when I was, when I'd missed that putt. And it's interesting because there's others that do this. So I pay attention to the pros when they kind of chime in on this journey of, trying to be happy and because Rory has even talked about it. And I really, really respect Rory because he reads a lot. He, is trying to be a better person. He understands, and he's not just in front of his nose right now. I mean, he talks about having kids and he talks about self-improvement and he wants to be a better person. I think for a really long time, he too defined his worth by the number that he shot on the golf course that day, which means if he shot a bad number, if he left too many out there, he comes off the course and he's just pretty much livid with himself. And frankly, in short, in a terrible mood. And the fact that the score you can shoot or this game that really doesn't have anything to do with your true value or the things that really matter, like family and loved ones. I mean, he has come to that realization. And yet, if I'm honest, there's this weird thing because he went through this big slump and when I say slump, I don't necessarily mean with play because I think he won on both bookends of this time, but he said, without the fans, and I think even more so where he had come to this realization of what was important, he's on the course, participating in this thing that is his livelihood, and yet he has no motivation to do it because he knows at the end of the day, it just doesn't really matter. So how do you conjure up the motivation of doing something when you know that at the end of the day, if it was the last day on earth, would you be spending your time here? And his answer absolutely in that moment, would be no. And so I think it kind of robbed him of this normal, almost get angry at yourself. And I think it's funny, I'm reading a book and I think you would have experienced this with basketball, at least I'd expect so, whether it came from your dad or whether it came from inside of you, you almost have to drive yourself with that same sort of strict, mad at yourself determination in order to produce results and get you to work hard enough to make an achievement, to drive that motivation inside of you to shoot 10,000 free throws so that under pressure situations, you're going to make them. And anyway, I've tried to get to that place. It's been incredibly unsuccessful, which is funny because then I heard Justin Thomas, who was like, and I think he's trying to get to that place. And Rory's got a few years on him, but he came out with a quote that was something like, unfortunately right now, a lot of my life is golf. And so although I would love it not to be, if I shoot a bad number, yeah, I'm going to be in a bad mood because a lot of the pie of my life right now is golf. And I really relate to both theories. And I'm frankly probably closer to Justin Thomas because I have such little success with Rory. In fact, when I'm more in that Rory space, which I think is healthier, I can't get the same results out of myself as I do when I'm really hard on myself.
It seems like there are so many buckets that we're involved in our daily lives, whether it's with, you can take family, but that's split into different categories as well. Your relationship with your wife could be great, but then you could have a rough day with one of the kids or multiple kids, all of the kids, or it could be flipped. But then you also have your professional life. Then you have the passions that you have, whether it's reading or a sport or a craft or any sort of talent that you want to pursue. And so if you're defining yourself as a golfer on the day that you go golfing and that goes poorly, then I think it's easy for me to be like, oh, I suck at life, right? And there'll be days where of the 5 categories that I'm supposed to be focused on that day, 4 of them will be bad. And one of them will be okay, average. And so then I'll come home and I'll be like, man, I'm a loser. I'm a straight up loser because I lost, did what I was supposed to do anyway. I'm a loser.
Well, yeah, you've wanted to sell your golf clubs way too many times. And that's because, yeah, you're a driver and you really want to be good and you want to be good now and you have the ability to be good. So when it doesn't happen, it's terribly frustrating, especially from someone who has always had success. And that's me too. I've had to drive to be good at things and I don't know how to drive myself, or particularly drive myself to similar results with also while having that Zen approach to what's really important.
Well, as a father, what do you teach your kids around where is their self-worth supposed to be?
Yeah, I want them to be good human beings and I want them to be kind and I want them to understand who is important in their life and to treat them with respect. And
what does being good though mean? What does being kind mean?
I think that they go through the world and they live the golden rule. They see past their nose, or at least try to at a younger age, that they're polite, right? And that they also have a backbone and stand up when they know something's right or when they know something's wrong, that they are able to defend that and be a good example to others and frankly stand up for others who might not have a voice. Those are the kinds of things that I want them to do. Unfortunately, especially at least as I'm seeing it evolve, kids are more likely to do what they've seen or do according to the examples in their life than they are the words that they've been told certainly by their parents. Sometimes others have more success, but it's almost like they have this wall that's like my parents and they're not going to listen. You could teach Jared how to shoot a basketball probably better than anybody. But if, it goes according to how it probably will go, Jared may be immune to anything you're going to tell him and he's not going to listen, right? Just like the other day when I tried to help Nora with golf, she probably couldn't find a better teacher, but she's not going to listen to me.
Yeah, but she's going to cherish that time with you, right? Before you came, I was talking to Noelle, what's your favorite thing to do with your mom? What's your favorite thing to do with your dad? And she was saying something around daddy-daughter dates. I was like, oh, what? What do you like to do? I don't know. I just like spending time, right? And she tried to remember what they did on the last mommy-daughter date. She couldn't remember what they did, but there was the feeling that they were together and they were spending time together. But going back to where do you get your self-worth, and it's being kind and being respectful and being an overall good person, how do you approach the fact that there probably at least once a day we fail at that, like miserably?
As an adult or as teaching our children to do that?
Both, right? Like I'm not going to think of an example right now, but I'm sure that today at some point I was maybe short with somebody, or I wasn't as kind as I could have been, or I passed up somebody who needed help, or I was ignoring somebody. So does that make me a bad person? Does that make my self-worth go down? Should it?
Well, so that just brings another question to mind, which is, eventually when you give yourself an excuse and you keep repeating a behavior, it's just like, it's not an excuse anymore. Like, that's actually who you are. So recognizing it, for starters, I think is where you begin. And then something has to be in place, whether it's that I was, self-castigating way too harshly in order to produce results within myself and drive myself really hard. In Tiger Woods' case, it was Earl Woods. Like, Earl Woods was really hard on Tiger, almost and he actually used his military tactics and mind games to drive performance in Tiger. And luckily, Tiger loved it. And so he continued with it and he enjoyed that game. But it was funny. So Ryan Holiday is the author of the book I'm reading right now, and he dives into this a little bit. So they had a safe word, actually, Tiger and Earl. And I didn't know this. And so if Earl's, shenanigans, because I'd always heard about the one where he would like jingle his keys while Tiger was swinging, or like throw his keys like right in front of the ball and say things. And it was worse than that. Like, he would drop some pretty serious taunts and some pretty serious words while Tiger would swing. And that's why Tiger developed that ability to stop his swing like mid gear, right? And then just pull back and redo it. But what do you think the safe word was? Like, it was almost insult to injury. And Tiger never said it.
Wasn't it like I quit or I give up or something like
enough.
That?
Enough.
Yeah.
And Tiger, and that it's funny because in some of those instances, it sounds like, it was almost like, Tiger was never going to be willing to admit that it was enough. In fact, it wasn't necessarily the golf sometimes. It was the depth and intenseness of the training. And Tiger always wanted to be able to say it's never enough. Like, I will push through this. He loved being able to perform and not be broken. Which, yeah, it worked and it showed up. But then there was these other, unchecked.
Well, something's got to give, right? And that's what I think is so hard from a societal perspective, as well as, and especially with a religious perspective, right? Is that when you're holding this carrot of, if you're striving for this perfection and you're striving to avoid the sins and you're striving to not be bad, and then you mess up, and then the thought of, I'm going to hell, or, I don't fit in this party, right? I think that we get, at least what we see culturally here, is this facade of excellence, or everything's okay, right? I'm fine. Or, how are you? Oh, I'm fantastic. And we've talked about this too, about the difference between here and Russia. In Russia, if you said, hey, how are you? They'd tell you, I'm terrible. My dog died. My life's a mess. My job sucks. My relationship with they'll tell you. Here, how are you? And all of those things could be true. They could have just lost their dog. They just lost their job. They just got divorced, whatever. I'm great. How are you? Like, it's just like this knee-jerk reaction of you can't admit that you're imperfect. And I don't know. So when we talk about this self-worth thing, if my self-worth is based off of a religious system of, I am only worth something if I do this, and this, which I think that most religions actually don't say that. I think that what they actually try to teach is not that if you mess up that you're done, but I think culturally it gets translated into that, right? Of, John and Jane are better people because they attend more meetings, or they have more service hours at the homeless shelter than I do, or their kids never talk back in front of me. So again, as I'm trying to teach my kids, where is your self-worth? I think it's tough. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I think it changes based off of the situation that you're in.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because I have something that I think would be good to talk about. But full circle, in that 1% better every day, like we can't just say, oh yeah, because I think, remember Jay Golden Kimball, who ultimately like would cuss during general conference talks, but he said he would like ask for forgiveness like every night in his prayers. And look, there could be some genuineness to that. But what I'm getting at is, let's say you're unkind every day, or that you didn't reach out or help somebody, today. And then you're like, well, my profession or my religion professes that I can, be forgiven. And so, but then there's like, but if you just keep doing that every day and it never modifies your behavior, then I don't think that's the design either. Right. So what are you doing? That's a
mathematical problem though, that isn't real.
So 1% better every day. Like, so how is Eric going to try to do something that does make, and maybe he still is going to ignore somebody every day, but how does he get 1% better every day?
Well, again, if we do that as like a math problem, right? What's 1%? So if I'm awake for 16 hours in the day, right? That's 960 minutes. Is that right?
Okay.
16 hours times 60, 960 minutes.
Okay.
And then let's just say I'm making a decision every 5 seconds. Well, let's just say once a minute. I'm making one decision a minute. So I've made 960 decisions today, even though it's way more than that because every word I choose to say is a decision. But let's just say for kicks and giggles, I make 1,000 decisions in the day. So how do you go back on all of those decisions and say, okay, decision number 1 was a 10, decision number 2 was a 4, decision number 3 was a 6. And so then are you saying, okay, everything that's 6 and above was a good decision, and I made 51 of those, and so 1% better, I need to do, well, I guess 501 of those. So 1% better, I need to do 511.
Well, in my mind, I guess the 1% better is simply that you say, okay, look, I'm taking stock today. You're kind of talking about that. Yours is a little bit more analytical than most. And you're saying, okay, look, in sort of a higher level perspective, you're like, these are the things that I probably shouldn't have done today or could do better. Just like on the golf course, when you finish, you're like, oh, there's 4 shots that I left out there. Like, what could I do to capitalize on those better and actually take advantage of them next time? It doesn't always mean that you do, but what are you doing to try? And if you're taking steps to make improvements so that those do go away, that you do treat the person kindly, that you don't have that oversight tomorrow, that's what that statement means to me.
See, I think golf is a good example, though, because as you look back on those 4 shots, I could have putt better, right? But there will be days where you putt amazing, but for whatever reason, the other shots aren't working, which seems to be the case with me, right? They're kind of the 4 major off the tee, irons, chipping, putting,
right? Kind
of the 4 major areas of golf. And it seems like 2 of the 4 for me on any given day are bad, but those 2 rotate every time I go. There'll be days where I can't miss a putt. There'll be days where I can't make a putt. And so again, going back to your daily decisions, because each of those 1,000 decisions also have different weights to them, right? Meaning how heavily do we weight the importance of that decision? In my interaction with my boss, is that weighted the same as my interaction with a YouTube video on whether or not to keep watching it or not, right? I think there are different weights. So as we go through those lives and you're like, okay, I want to improve how I treat people in certain situations, or I want to improve how I speak, you're going to put pressure to improve one area, but another area has to give. And so on that day, you're going like, oh yeah, I spoke much more clearly. I didn't use these words, whatever. I didn't cuss. Great. Well, I also kind of messed up some other area. I think you'll always find something every day and several things every day where you're like, oh, I could have done that better. And then the next day when I do that, I didn't exercise though today. Oh, that means tomorrow I need to go exercise. So I exercised that day, but then I didn't spend as much time with a spouse or something, right? So that's what's so hard in my mind, is to reconcile the fact of this self-worth thing, because I think that you can assign your self-worth to everything that you do, and wherever your focus goes. If your self-worth is how I treat my wife, some days that'll be good, some days that'll be bad. So does that mean the days that it's not necessarily great, I'm worthless? I don't think so. But then I could shift that self-worth to how I played basketball, or I could shift that self-worth to how I performed at work. And was I productive 100% of the time when I was there, or did my mind kind of wander? Like, oh, I could have been more focused for longer, all 8 hours rather than 7 hours and 55 minutes.
Yeah. And because so in some of the Eastern religions and some of the Eastern talk, like I believe in Buddhism, I mean, they're going to say you need to get to this place of enlightenment where you're completely disconnected so that your worth is 100% independent and not related to any of those things.
What is it related to?
It's related to you and your center and knowing in and of yourself, like who you are and what your purpose is. And the fact that you are, you know, I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but it's not tied to those other activities or anything outside of yourself. It's all contained within, you know, who you are. So there's no expectations. There's just, stillness and center and seeking to, and removal of all of that, if you will.
And what if I can't find that?
Well, that's life. That's all of us. That's what we're all, I don't know. That's
so is
the
my
way.
self-worth low? Because
Well,
you see
exactly.
that now. I mean, I don't know if it's always been the case or if it's just because of the accessibility to it, but the rates of depression, suicide, all of this stuff. I mean, you're getting to that point because at some point they're saying my self-worth is low, right? Going to from a depression standpoint, my self-worth is low and I don't feel good about that. I don't feel good about my situation. I don't feel good about myself. I don't feel good about my relationships, whatever that could be. Something in their head has got them focused on something that didn't go particularly well for that day, that week, that month, years. And that's caused this feeling of low self-worth, right? And so I don't know the answer, right? Because I fluctuate within the day. There are times like, oh, I accomplished something. That's great. I went for a jog in the morning. I woke up early and went for a jog. That feels good. And then I don't go for a jog for 3 months. And then I'm like, I'm a fat slob.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It comes down to that complacency versus that you're talking about versus contentment, and that's what's really hard because even, you know, so this is what I was going to read from this Greg McKeown, but he just talks about how when we allow our wants to overshadow what we already have, we become focused only on acquiring what we don't have. And we are left to pursue the next thing that will surely make us happy. And that's where, how do we get to that place, but not rob ourselves of the motivation to try and be better, but be content with where we're at, like all at the same time. It's almost like
that makes me so scared as a father, right? I bring up our kids and I look at, especially, I mean, you're a father to 2 daughters. So I kind of get boys, I think. I mean, in the sense of Jared, right? Like I've been there. I don't get girls at all, but then I look at what the girls have to deal with where every magazine cover is photoshopped. You have every TV show is unrealistically, made up dolls, right? That are put in situations to look good or bad. And you look at every Instagram, Facebook post is everybody at their best and fitness instructors. I mean, my wife is a fitness instructor, right? So where is that contentment with where her body is based off of other fitness instructors who can do certain tasks better than she can? But she can also do tasks better than her. But the focus goes on, well, their abs are more cut than mine, or their legs are slimmer than mine, or their arms are more toned than mine, right? So this comparison of, and all of the messages that are getting sent to them through every media source possible of, you're not attractive enough, you're not skinny enough, you're not involved enough, you're not putting out enough, right? With your like all of these things change that mindset of what a self-worth individual is. So is it tied to your sexual relationships? Is it tied to your body? Is it tied to your mind? What is it tied to? It scares me to death. It scares me to death to have any of these and to try and help my daughters understand, like, yeah, I know that everyone around you is saying it's important on how many dates did you go on, but it's really not. It's really not.
Right. And that's, frankly, that's just like, so I'm going to make a comparison and a parallel. That idea, which I am always I think about it all the time. But this idea that we are to not pursue the things that almost have this built-in reinforcement, like I initially brought up with drugs, I think we're all programmed and wired to try to find comparisons and to try to find things that drive our purpose and self-worth. And we are quite influenced by what we think those could be. And yet then on the other side of that, like somehow we're supposed to just be content, completely walled against the world. And when I say that, like our contentment and happiness and self-worth and value should be somehow in this like time capsule inside of ourselves, completely cut off from any influence from the outside. And that's what we would hope for our kids, right? That they understand that they are loved by their parents, that they have worth as a human being and deserve to be treated that way and should treat other people that way. And that's the center truth for everything. And yet instead it's much more about those other things, and those other influences, and of which there are many, and it's an onslaught. And you wouldn't think that, anyway, yeah.
Oh, even, and then who's assigning this worth? Is there a point to where you truly are worthless, right? Is there a point to where, okay, you're murdering everybody that you come in contact with, you're a pretty worthless person, right? Is that the extreme, right? Because my mind always goes to extremes, and then reality is somewhere in here, right? But is there a truly worthless person? Is that someone who's strung out and not ever conscious ever because is that a worthless individual? Is that a worthless soul?
Yeah, I've had this conversation a little bit about this very extreme. And I think that there was a stage. So when I think of just the scum of the earth, unfortunately, I usually think about Elizabeth Smart's kidnapper. And I think at some point in time, somewhere, there was a decision made and he took a fork in the road. And additionally, there could have been emotional imbalances, chemical imbalances. Like, we don't know the deck and how it was stacked for that person. But at some point, I feel like there was a decision where, yes, he had worth and he had value, and he just maybe needed some assistance or someone to listen, or a therapist, or even maybe a medical doctor to help him. But it gets to a point where, whether it's repeated murders, repeated negligence against human beings, repeated being a bad person, I think eventually those little acts can remove worth. It doesn't mean that they're beyond saving, but I do think they get to a point where a decision has to be made. I mean, capital punishment was a human and controversial attempt to try to say that they have determined that person doesn't have worth or is doing more damage than good by being here. Because I think that worth button and that worth opportunity is always there, but some of them waste it, and some of them aren't worth the damage and difficulty that they cause. So I'd love to think that Elizabeth Smart's captor at some point is still valuable as a human being, but I think that's in the past. I think they get to a point where they've sort of sacrificed that worth.
Is there redemption for someone like that?
Well, once again, I think there's always at least a little bit of oil in that vessel to try to be redeemed and to be saved and to make changes. And certainly I think, the Lord feels that way, but he also expects us to have some accountability and responsibility and to make good choices. And when we have a decision, if we continually ignore what we should do or what we're being prompted to do, and frankly, just the obvious thing to do, which is to not hurt other human beings. If we ignore that enough, I think eventually we have to come to call.
What if you're not taught that, though?
Oh, agreed. But I think that so I even mentioned the drugs and lust thing at the beginning, trying to, and I know I can't totally do this just because that's the set of paradigms I was born with, but trying to remove those. And I feel like if you're born as a human being on this earth, it's not a stretch nor difficult for your brain to say, I'm a human and these others are humans as well. And although it was Christ who taught the golden rule of like, hey, however you want to be treated, treat others that way. That seems pretty obvious now, and maybe that would be absent from somebody's life. But I still think that I feel like we're born to at least be able to put together to say, hey, I've got 10 fingers and 10 toes, and that person, thinks, breathes, and sleeps like me. Like maybe I should work to create a world that we both like are happy in, or treat that person as though they're my equal. And that seems like you wouldn't have to be taught that.
See, I think that might be just as dangerous though, because I don't think that everybody wants to be treated the same way, right? So you're saying treat others how you would want to be treated. I don't know that you necessarily would want to be treated how I want to be treated, right? I think that you have certain desires or certain feedback mechanisms or certain ways of communication where you prefer one way and I prefer another, right? And so I think a lot of times people do put themselves in someone else's head, right? You're like, oh, you're an irrational person because I would do this. I would want it to be this way. How can you not see that that's how it is, right?
Right.
And so I think that we all, I don't know. I think that that's a little bit tough to accomplish, where if it's like, oh, if I've fallen and I've scraped my knee, yeah, like go help someone get up. I think there are pretty obvious situations, but I think that there are a lot more less obvious situations of interacting with people, right? If you have a gripe with somebody at work, would you want them to come out and flat out say, hey, I can't stand the way you do this, right? I can't stand the way your emails are typed out. It drives me crazy. Or would you prefer them to come and do it a little bit softer approach? Because there are people that will prefer different ways of communication or handling certain issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I suppose I come from a place of thinking about the heavy, obvious ones, like, hey, I
like, do you want
you
to
have
be
a wife
murdered?
and kids, no. Like I'm not going to come and murder them, or I'm not going to come and steal them in the middle of the night. You have food. Like if I need some, let's say I am starving, and I should ask because it's not mine. And I know, and that one I know is.
See, but how many of those opportunities do you have in your day-to-day life versus the much more subtle decisions that you have to make in interacting with humans that are very complex?
Yeah, I mean, in the business world and in emails, for example, there's lots of ways where, yeah, I'm not Eric on the other side, so I don't know exactly how they would want it typed up or how they would want it to read. So it can be difficult to know exactly how.
Because I think you're very good from a communication standpoint, for the most part, of like, you don't try to offend anyone. You don't come out, you're not going to try and say anything that could possibly offend someone. And there are some coworkers right now, same thing. Like as we're coming up with messaging, their biggest thing is, I don't want to offend anybody. Right. So let's make this the most, I don't want to say like lukewarm, but the most like neutral message as possible. Right. But there are several times where Eric personally is like, what are you trying to say? Right. Don't beat around the bush. Like, what is it that you want? But other people don't want that communication, right? And we have some from a work-wise part, and I don't know if anyone's going to listen to this from this work anyway, but on the other side, that they have this remarkable, in my opinion, gift of just cutting straight through everything and just getting right to the point, right? And it can come off abrasive if that's not what you're used to, because they won't tiptoe around things. They're just like, you've got a problem with me. What is it? Let's deal with it now and move on. When others are like, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing.
You've read about this place, or you've been to this place?
No, I work with this place.
Oh.
Yeah. And I admire that because I don't have that level of it, right? I think that to a certain point, I'll come out and say things, but like they don't have time to waste on the politics of the office, so they don't have time to waste on being overly nice. I mean, again, they're not mean. They're just very direct, right? And again, culturally, going back to Russia, very similar, right? Are they all that way? No. But as a whole, they're much more direct. And so they don't want to be treated the way that you would want to be treated, to be honest, right? And so how can you manage that do unto others what you would have done to you when they don't want to have done to them what you want done to you.
Right. Yeah. It's just interesting. So, I mean, my thoughts on the matter come from like the same place. There's a scene in The Lord of the Rings, I don't know if you've seen it, where Sam and Frodo come across on accident an army from an army on Oliphants that's coming in to go against Rohan. Anyway, so at the moment they're getting, there's a group of men from Gondor that find them and are going to capture them and take them back to the city. Anyway, so Lord Faramir sees one of the casualties of war from the other side that they killed in order to not die themselves. And they're there with a moment to ponder, and he's looking at him and he's like, look, his responsibility was the same as yours. He's probably fighting for his family and his country just like you are. And I wonder what his, mom is going to do now. And I wonder what challenges and things that he had in his heart, because ultimately he was recognizing, like, in this weird way, we're both on opposite sides of this war, but really there's not that much that divides us, if anything at all. And that's kind of where I come from on that, larger golden rule, is that there's some level that we are born with where we're a human and we see a human, and we have to know that there's commonality there.
Yeah, we all have hopes and dreams, and that was kind of one of the biggest things that hit me really hard while I was in Russia. Is there's a drinking problem, at least where I was, and it was in winter. It was it was in winter, and we're coming off of this bus station, and they've got this tarp over this body, and legs, feet are exposed. It's clearly a dead body. They froze overnight, and there's this bottle of alcohol laying right by him, right? So there's this person, and I don't know how old they were because all I could see was frostbitten feet, right? And then we walk up a little bit, and it's still kind of now midday, and we walk by this elementary school, and there are all these kids that are playing, right? Just these little kids. They're all happy as can be. It's freezing cold outside, but they're all happy as can be. They're playing. They've got friends. Someone has cooties, whatever, right? All the things that little kids are worried about and thinking about with art projects or playing games. And I was like, that guy at one point was there, right? At one point, that guy who's just died from getting hammered drunk, not understanding his surroundings, and staying outside. Possibly he was homeless. I don't know. But at one point, he was this little kid that had a best friend, and they had a mom and dad, you would assume. They cared about him, right? And so that was like, oof, right? Like, what changed, or where in your fork idea around like Elizabeth Smart's chapter, like, where did that start to go the wrong direction? Was it the day before because something crazy happened, or was it a lifelong path that was or was not due to his own decisions, right? Because the not homeless shelters, but where kids go, orphanages in Eastern Europe are insane, right? Where these kids don't have parents. And you can watch it, you can take, just to make it not too personal so we don't all cry, but the Queen's Gambit, right? She's sitting there and she is without parents. So how does someone judge that person based off of the decisions where she starts to pursue the pills that she takes, or she pursues alcohol or whatever else it is, when they're coming from circumstances that I can't even imagine, right? And it's much worse than just losing your parents in a car accident. There are much worse things than that, I think, out there from an abusive perspective and from I don't know. And so how much of that onus is on that individual? Like, how much are we really responsible for based on our upbringing, the kind of nature nurture thing? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I think about that all the time, right? And so when I am quick to judge somebody, which I'm usually pretty quick in the moment to judge somebody, and then later I'm like, maybe I should have. And I'm trying to reduce that time gap. But no, I think taking that perspective a lot of times is like, like maybe. I've come to like humanity a lot more with that mindset. even though there's a lot of terrible things that people do and terrible things that people have to endure, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but I don't know. I feel like having not, and that trip to Kansas City, I think I told you about, with where I went and saw Donnie, being the fact that we're in Utah, you're from Idaho, it's probably two of the most whitewashed states in the United States, meaning the number of African Americans that I know personally, I can count on my two hands, right? And that I could consider friends. And so to go to Kansas City, where it's pretty equal there, and to see the differences and to see the cultural things that are going on there, like, I have no real ground to stand on if I'm going to have a conversation around the race debate, because going there, it was very obvious that there was a very different, the two races were treated very differently and for centuries, right? Like those two races were treated significantly differently, and one side is set back quite a bit, like dramatically, because of those things, right? So can I really blame anybody for being skeptical of another race in that situation? And I don't know that I can. Like I don't know the answer to it, but I don't know that I can make a stance of like, no, like racism doesn't exist. Like it exists. I haven't been in it, right? Like I haven't lived in a place where I can see that. So again, whether that's a racism thing, whether that's a gender thing, whether that's whatever, or any of these 7 deadly sins, I don't know. I feel like I've been living a pretty sheltered life, which is a good thing. I think it's kind of avoided a lot of pain that probably could have come otherwise, but I still kind of want to experience life
Some
a little
pain.
bit.
Can I just
Not
have
pain.
some pain? Can
Not
I order
pain.
that up Amazon?
No, not pain, but I don't know, life experiences.
Well, I think that they're not 100%, but they're pretty close synonyms, to be honest. I think that the inner child usually having to deal with pain is what causes some of those breaks, causes some of those forks in the road. Like all of us have an inner child a lot of the time, even in happy, loving homes. Like there's this dysfunctional break because you have all these different people that process the world totally different. And so loving to one might not have been loving to the other. And even more so when like parents were completely absent or didn't show up, or the parents are completely unfit to be parents. And so they just constantly yell and scream and accuse their kids of, well, they treat their kids poorly when they're in a bad mood, or they treat their kids good when they're in a good mood. And it has nothing to do with the child's behavior, which just leads to crazy confusion. Children that think that they don't know what's coming next. And so that leads to breaks and dysfunction. And yeah, you can never really know somebody's full profile or full background. And so, yeah, we should all be a little bit kinder when we are quick to judge.
So moving it then, so what is good and bad?
That's the question I was asking you. I'm glad we were full circle, but that's what I was asking you.
Right, because I think I was talking with my dad possibly. But we were talking around the fact of, it was around forgiveness, right? Like there's this whole conversation around, we should forgive people. I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Like if someone comes and I'm eating ice cream and they dump the ice cream all over me, like, okay, I forgive you, I guess. But does that mean that I'm going to go get another cup of ice cream and eat it right in front of that person, right? Like what does forgiveness really mean? And when are we required to forgive somebody? And then at least from a biblical standpoint, we're supposed to forgive no matter what, and not just if, but when restitution doesn't happen. Because most of the time, restitution doesn't happen. Somebody offends you, most of the time, they don't come back and say, hey, I'm really sorry about that. A thief steals something out of your garage, most of the time, that person doesn't come back and say, oops, sorry, you can have it back now. And I don't know, so from a forgiveness standpoint, that's one aspect, but then also like what is good, what is bad, and how has that changed over the course of humanity?
Yeah, that's why I ask that question, because I think if we were left to determine that on our own without any sort of preset guides, I think that like our actions and stuff would be different. And you said it's culture, because maybe we're not forbidden from those things. Maybe we are supposed to figure out that they're, I don't know, bad to begin with, but we are kind of taught that. Like if you touch that substance, or if you do that, or if you do this, like you're immediately bad, or you're, so there's not any, what's that?
Unclean.
Sure. There's not any overlap with those. So.
Well, and what's so interesting to me is how it's changed over time, of how what good and bad has changed. And I'm not saying it's good or bad that it's changed. I just noticed the change of, and we brought it up earlier, but one wife / concubines,
right,
versus many is an example. The way that people treat different races, right? I just finished a book that was all about, Christopher Columbus coming over and the Native American genocide and kind of how that all went down. And like in that instance, legally, it was good to treat a certain race poorly and to take their stuff and to make up false allegations so that they could kill them. And it was like, yeah, that's all right. Because look, we got farmland, and in that case, they thought like, yeah, we're doing the right thing. And I don't know, I think that's what's so tough. So I look at what we're thinking now and what we hold valuable and what we think is important and good. And then in 100, 200, 300 years, are they going to look back and like, how could humans have ever thought that to be the case?
Right. On that same vein, from the Lord of the Rings, I think, and I know that there were segments that also believed this, but world wars feel like that, like especially with social media uniting most of the world. I'm like, how could you ever have another world war? How could we go against a people that we, compete in the Olympics with, not against? One way or another, it's a with, because it's maybe not an entertainment. It is entertaining, and it obviously sells big TV contracts, but you're with, like, it's a uniting of countries. It's not some sort of dividing activity, the Olympics. And World War it just is insane to me that at one point in time, a country thought that it was okay to just go kill the sons and daughters or whatnot of another country. And look, I know problems are complex and things get important, but my goodness, it seems like, can't we be adults and like figure this out without you thinking that you can, like you said, steal stuff or steal people or justify means?
War is so strange to me too, because it's leaders of a government telling the subordinates to go kill other people from the government. And there's always some sort of a propaganda machine going there where the other side, you have to dehumanize that other side to convince thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people to go kill tens of thousands of other millions of people. But it's a small group of people that are looking over and saying, oh, I want that. Go die for it.
Right.
They don't die for it, right? The
Right.
presidents of the countries aren't dying for that. Congressmen and women aren't dying when we go to war. It's the other people that are going in the other government. Again, the leaders of those governments, and for the most part, aren't dying. And if they do, it's at the cost of a lot of other people that died that really have nothing to do with it, right? They don't even
Right.
need to necessarily believe in the cause. It's just, if you don't, then we're going to kill you. So you decide how you're going to die. I think it's sad.
It's brutal. Yeah, it's brutal.
But you go back to, the Middle East specifically, and the Palestinian conflict and everything else. That's been going on for thousands of years, right? And so how do you tell a family that has had so many loved ones killed, murdered, probably pretty by intense ways, torture, whatever, yeah, just forgive him. Like, let's just stop. It's like, no, I need to avenge my brother, my mom, my dad, my sister, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the forgiveness is something that's for us, right? Like Elizabeth Smart, once again, I mean, she's an incredible example. And I mean, we see this in the scriptures too, but forgiveness is for that true, unadulterated and unheld back forgiveness isn't, I don't think, for the offender. I think it's usually for us, and sort of frees us up to move on. Otherwise, I think you create this sticking place and past which you cannot really go. And I think she knew that in order to have a life and have a family, which she has done beautifully, and I'm sure that there's still hang-ups and such, but to move past it, she was going to have to forgive and truly have this surrendering to the Lord to say, this is going to have to be taken care of by him, and I trust him to figure that out, and that this person will get a rightful whatever it is. Because if his scenario and his background story is so bad that some sort of benign punishment is right, I'm going to have to trust him to do that. And if he cognizantly made decisions and chose evil, he's going to be made right in that sense too, which I have to surrender that. And that's hard for us to do, especially as humans. We like to control, we like to organize, we like to vindicate, like it feels good, right? We see all those movies about the Liam Neeson movies, Jason Bourne movies, where it's like revenge, and it's almost glorified. And and granted, they know that it's going to be hollow, but for like those 10 seconds of like when they actually get it, it's almost celebrated. I mean, the whole movie builds up to those particular climax moments.
Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite movies and
right.
books.
Oh yeah,
time,
totally.
That's like straight
and
up,
I'm
going to ruin everybody's life.
Everybody. I love Jim Caviezel in that, and he was brilliant. And I was rooting for him to get everybody back at full tilt.
Well, I was thinking too, this was also the conversation previously about forgiveness and that we're currently having, but all of these, I'm looking in it long-term, long vision as a society. I feel like a society will function more smoothly the less we could do some of these things, right? So take forgiveness as an example. And again, with forgiveness, kind of to our decisions conversation, I think there are different levels to where it's like, oh yeah, it's easy to forgive certain things and really hard, if not impossible, to forgive other things. But imagine a society where nobody can forgive everybody, and you just have this extremely distrustful, nothing happens society, right? So I think forgiveness has to happen for a society to function. And to what level, I don't know. But again, going back to the Palestinian conflict, like there's a severe level of non-forgiveness, which again, I'm not judging them for not being able to, because I can't imagine what they've gone through. But because of that, you see this circle of death that just goes on for decades, centuries, millennia. And then I think same thing, like lust, gluttony, greed, slothfulness, wrath, envy, pride. Societally, think of the implications of being unable to curb those.
Well, that's what we're having the conversation about, because it's like, what is the implication for not curbing those? Like pick, or let's just pick the benign ones, like drugs. I mean, they're illegal by definition. I know that there are people who do them recreationally that aren't hurting themselves or anybody else in theory.
Are you talking like hard drugs? Or are you talking all drugs? Are you talking?
Well, not just marijuana, let's say. I mean, there was a documentary on a guy that he was one of the chemists who came up with many of the combinations. And so I think he came up with like LSD and a smattering of the other ones that I wouldn't even know about, because I don't know enough about all the like acid and stuff like that. And I mean, I think he would almost take them as like experiments, like to see like, oh, well, what does this one do? And so in a sense, he was never.
I think like the German soldiers went out on, was it ecstasy?
Oh yeah. Well, not ecstasy. They
were taking.
Yeah, they were. And it made them super soldiers essentially. And It removed their emotional like trigger points. And maybe you hit on it. Maybe I think with everything, war included, we learn right and wrong and through experiment, through that scientific process that I was talking about. And then when we go through pain and heartache because of one of the things, whether it's addiction to one of these, whether it's because you were envious or prideful or lustful, like, and it wreaks havoc and leaves a wake of destruction and sadness. And so then somebody writes about it. Maybe they write 10 Commandments about it. I don't know, right? Or maybe they write 7 Deadly Sins about it. And then that's a word to the wise for the future to say, hey, trust me on this. I know you haven't experienced it yourself yet, but I promise these things never lead to any sort of happiness, goodness, whatever. And so,
but I don't think they never do. I think it's just the majority of time they won't.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, and that's where it's really hard.
Sleeping around, never like cheating on spouses, and then live to 110 years old and have great lives. Sure.
Right. Well, I had
great life is I don't know.
Well, I think about that one quite a lot because I had a step grandfather who smoked for like 60 years. And I mean, goodness sakes, he lived till he was like 90 something. And I don't think it was from lung cancer.
There are people who don't smoke a day in their lives and they die of lung cancer.
Right. And so what is good? Maybe it's that. Maybe it's that we have to engage with the world and take steps in our life, like thinking beyond. And that's what all of these are, as well as the other ones. Maybe this is just counsel from others who have already gone through it. And so we can save ourselves some heartache by just trusting the counsel of others. Maybe that's one way to say what's right or what's wrong.
But if you only had one, bad. I mean, this is the thing that everyone uses, and I don't particularly like it, but you brought it up earlier. If you only had one day to live, what would you do?
Right.
Would you just hug your family for 24 hours? Would you go golf?
I don't know. I mean, it's a terribly macabre thought, to be perfectly honest, because I think I would be so overwhelmed with that idea of either trying to fit it all in or just being frozen in fear to like do nothing.
Because you don't know when your last day is. There are very, very few people who know when their last day is.
Right.
None of us know. You have no control over how you die.
Right.
Right. The majority of us.
Well, and so I've read a lot of books, and even the scriptures do this to some extent, but there's the word that some of the modern books use is that mortality motivation, meaning you're going to die. You know it's an inevitability. It's in your future. You don't know which day it is. And so live every day as though, like, if it were your last, you'd be okay with that. Because obviously you can't live in fear of it being your last day, which is kind of what I was getting at first. But you can live every day so great and aligned with your center and your core and your purposes that, and prioritizing those most important things, that if in fact sleep did take you, you would be satisfied with, the day that you lived.
I think that's so hard though, because like, no offense to my work and my job, really any of them ever, right? Like if I knew it was my last day, I'm probably not going into work.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's tough.
Yeah.
There was another similar thing from a Christianity standpoint is like, oh, if Jesus came today, would you feel comfortable with what you're wearing, with what you say, with who you're hanging out with what music you're listening to, all of this stuff, right? One of them was around like kind of like a church meeting. If he attended, would you be comfortable with what you were doing in that meeting?
You mean checking Facebook during the sacrament? That's not okay.
Something like that. But I mean, flipping that conversation is like, what would he be doing, right? If you believe in a Jesus or a Savior or whatever else, like, would he be looking around and sitting up on the stage and with his nose raised, or would he be down amongst everybody and trying to be a nice human and figure out how they wanted to be treated and then treating him that way? Would he be in the $5,000 suit, or would he be in jeans and a t-shirt with its sleeves ripped off? Like,
I mean, if his time here was any indication, like, he probably wouldn't be in the congregations because he'd be out helping the people that actually were downtrodden, that genuinely were alone, that did need help, that were going through those tragedies. Maybe somebody was at that breaking point and he could actually, and he knew about it because he had that ability and could in fact help them and guide them back to that more human place where they are still redeemable.
I think there are other people like that too, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Have you met one?
Right there.
Oh my goodness. Don't butter
Did
me
we
up
answer your
like that.
question?
Well, are you sticking with your answer, which is that it's things that are beyond the end of your nose? Is that what you think it is? Is that what right?
What was the original? What is right and wrong? What is good and bad?
Well,
What is your original question?
my original question was based in, it's crazy because we're told certain things are bad, yet inherently via like scientific means, they almost have this internal positive reinforcement mechanism. So there's a dichotomy there. So, and yet, do I agree that they're bad? I mean, I don't know. And for the sake of this question, I mean, I don't know.
I think
so like
gluttony for like anything. We need food to survive.
Right.
So there's a positive feedback loop.
Totally.
But that positive feedback loop can spin out of control. We need to move and exercise. I think there's a point to where that spins out of control. So I think the everything in moderation, I guess.
Well, I would love, I mean, because when I think gluttony,
I think overeating.
you just think it's overeating?
That's just where my mind goes first. Is doing too much with something, right? So certain drugs, marijuana, I don't know that you can overdose. Again, I'm not familiar with drugs, right? But take cocaine as an example. There's serious consequences if you do too much, and it leads itself to get people to, or heroin or whatever else, to become dependent on it and do too much. Are there situations where pain pills or whatever else function correctly and achieve a purpose that is good? Yes. Do they spin out of control fairly frequently? Yes. Right? So is it inherently bad to have any of these kind of opioids? I don't know that it's inherently bad, but they do tend to push things over an edge that becomes dangerous. Same thing with all of these, right? Is having sex with another human being inherently bad? No. But I think that it can lead to other things that would be.
Yeah, so I like that answer, which is you have to think beyond the end of your nose. And obviously all of these have a clear negative loop that isn't difficult to see. The easy one with drugs, because I talk about some of the, I guess you could call them not hardcore drugs, but all of these seem to lead, like kind of like you were alluding to, like to meth eventually. And we've all seen the billboards, and we've all watched Breaking Bad, and we know like what the meth one does. And eventually that's just death, right? Like you're so far beyond reason, and your brain just is pretty much just fried. And maybe drugs is a unique one because they feel good, and maybe feeling good is just a terrible means to say that's actually positive reinforcement. But
there was a book I read on that where it was talking about like they had put like the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they're like, look, the biological urges are not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's the pursuit of pleasure. Like that is what the body is made to do, is pursue pleasurable things, right? And so you can call it, whether it's runner's high or whether it's a sexual relationship or whether it's food or anything else, like the natural creature biologically is pursuing pleasure always.
yeah,
And if that is hard work, the pleasure is actually the rest, right? The slothfulness or whatever else. And so it's interesting how some of the most pleasurable things are combined with some of the worst things, right? And I think of like, I hate being excessively tired, but then there's nothing like just waking up and knowing you can go back to sleep. Like it's just a great feeling. Or I hate being cold in the morning, but then there's nothing like a hot shower when it's freezing and you're just like, it feels so good. But then you got to get out again. So it's just like this.
right.
Everything really, really good. It can also be coupled with something really, really bad.
Yeah, and maybe that's the beauty. I know that's part of the magic here on this blue marble.
Well, that can be our next conversation of
The magic in blue marbles.
yes,
I
exactly.
knew that's the one you'd want to talk about.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up so you can get home.
Let's wrap it up.
All right. Bye.
Now everybody knows what's right and wrong. Is that what that
I
means?
think we made it worse. I think
We
that
made it terribly worse.
made
It's
it-
so muddy now.
Now nobody knows everything. is
Everybody go out and I'm pretty sure.
Sounds like we're all doing meth eventually.
My teeth are falling out shortly, I'm pretty sure.
All right.